Well, very good evening to one and all. It's a great pleasure to see this auditorium so full. It's a very pleasant surprise, and both I and our two guest speakers are most delighted. My name is Aaron Lee, and I have the privilege to be your host this evening. I happen to know both our guest speakers, and I will say a few words about each one of them before we start this evening. This evening, as you know, is what hopefully will be the first of a regular series of talks, with the whole intention of beginning this forum called True Conversations is to start to set high standards for civic discourse. Having dialogue on important issues that is conducted with reason, with dignity and civility. Now this is very important, and in fact it's critical, in my view, especially for institutions of higher learning. This is really a place where ideas are paramount, and people who are in universities have the privilege of leading the way in the arena of social conversation and dialogue. And as we further mutual understanding on important topics, we don't have to agree on everything. In fact, I think that's pretty impossible, but we must keep exchanging views. And in short, the purpose of True Conversations and an event of this kind is to recover the lost art of true conversation. So that's by way of introduction to this event, and hopefully the rest of the similar events under this series. I want to say that we hope to address different topics each time, but tonight we start with what possibly could be the most important question of all, and that is, why do we live? What is the meaning of life? And to elucidate this topic, we have the great privilege of having two special guests tonight, and they will introduce themselves properly as they begin to speak their minds about the topic. But I want to say a few words of welcome to each one of them. On my right is Dr. Katherine Lim. She hardly needs any introduction, to be honest. She's probably Singapore's most successful writer. She's authored many books, fiction, poetry, commentary. She's won many prestigious awards, and for a good number of years she's also been a political commentator. And I'm sure that many of us here follow her views very closely on her blog, especially in these past few months when we've had the GE and then now the PE. So Katherine is a self-described feminist, humanist, atheist, idealist, pragmatist, and I'll just stop there and let her introduce herself a little bit further. But welcome, Katherine.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That was a very kind introduction. I am just so pleased and honored to be here today. I always begin my participation at a conference like this, seminar like this, with a warning. And the warning is this: I am a compulsive, unstoppable storyteller, right? And no matter how elevated, how serious the topic is, I end up telling stories, and therefore sometimes go beyond my time. I have become the nightmare of meticulous timekeepers, so Aaron will have to keep an eye on me. Now, some years ago, this is just for some light-hearted sharing, because we are going to be so serious. I think a little bit of light-hearted sharing is in order. Some years ago, I was at an international conference with a very serious educational theme. The chairman was a very meticulous timekeeper, and he knew about my propensity to go on telling stories unstoppably. He had a special way of handling people like me. His usual practice was to put up little reminding cards to the speakers with little messages like 1.5 minutes more, time almost up. When he came to me, he put up this message, right, a very ominous one, and it read, "Your time has come." Right? It frightened me so much that I sat down instantly. But I'm sure Aaron wouldn't do anything like that.
I'll prepare that sign right now.
Well, I am just so pleased, as I've said, to be here for a sharing session. I think it can only be a sharing session because the topic, the meaning of life, is just so vast, so sprawling, so amorphous, and so subjective that I think it would be extremely difficult. It is virtually undiscussable. We cannot have any real discussion or debate in the real sense of the word because the topic is undiscussable, undebatable, maybe even non-negotiable. It's simply because, as I've said, it's so subjective. There must be as many meanings of life as there are persons in the auditorium here this evening. But it is an excellent topic for this reason. Despite the many differences, you will find that as we go along, there will be large overlapping areas. And the reason is this, simply because we are all human beings, I suppose, with common needs, aspirations, goals, passions, on one side, and on the other, fears, anxieties, aversions, revulsions. So as I've said, there will be a whole lot of commonalities. Therefore, I think Ronald has chosen an excellent topic, one that has a kind of a unity within diversity, a whole lot of common ground under the differences. Now, very quickly, with my remaining time, I'm just going to tell you what my meaning of life is, because it's going to be the frame, it's going to be the basis from which I will answer questions that Aaron will put to us and questions from the floor. But for me now, you will probably gasp to know this. I have been working at this frame of reference. I rather pretentiously call it my paradigm of faith and conviction for the last 30 years. My quest for meaning. And that was at age 40 when I sat down and asked myself, I said, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? What do I want? And immediately I had a starting point. I needed a starting point that was absolutely true, incontrovertible, a given. And it was this. For me, to have a meaning life is simply to be happy. Just to be happy. The next thing I had to do was, of course, to tease out the various aspects of the meaning of happiness in relation to myself. And now I'm going to tell you about a rather amusing mental game that I played and which might interest you if you want to get into this kind of intellectual exploration. I took out a piece of blank paper and put in the center happiness. And then I sprinkled around it all the synonyms for happiness, or strong associations, words that are used because they have strong associations with happiness, or common collocations for happiness, such as you would know, peace of mind, fame, family, relationships, love, security, wealth, friendship, and so on. Now, of course, because this was going to be a purely secularist framework, I left out values such as doing God's will, Christian charity, because I knew that this wouldn't come into my framework. What did I do next? Again, a very amusing, fun exercise. I constructed sentences using the word happiness, which now had been tied to meaning. I constructed it with each of these to see whether the sentences made sense to me or they were nonsense, so that I could reject the nonsensical sentences, keep the ones that struck at a true chord inside me, and then use that as raw material for the construction of my paradigm. So I had sentences like, I am happy, but I don't have peace of mind, which would be the greatest contradiction. Therefore, I knew that peace of mind was an absolutely essential part. And similarly for sentences like, I am happy, but I have no purpose in life. Again, it sounded absolutely nonsensical, contradiction, purpose. I am happy, but I have no sense of, I have no dignity, I have no sense of identity, I have no moral values. Now, so in this very systematic way, I collected those items that were absolutely essential for my happiness, which meant my meaning for life. Now, there were other values, of course, which were slightly lower order, which were slightly more related to worldly values, such as wealth, fame, health. Now, health came in very strongly. I had a sentence like, I am happy, but I'm in poor health, which sounded to me unacceptable. Right? So health became very important, so important that it was not just health in terms of freedom from illness. It had to be the robust kind of health that would enable me to enjoy life. Now, a sentence like, I am happy but I'm not wealthy, sounds okay to me, perfectly acceptable, so wealth was not an essential thing. But I rejected a sentence like, I am happy but I'm poor. Oh, no, I couldn't take poverty, right? I couldn't take one, so there had to be some kind of intermediate stage, like I'm happy because I'm financially independent. So there it was, I went through this. You'll be interested to know how I handled fame, simply because I'm a public figure and have some sort of fame. Now, I had a sentence like, I am happy, I have a little bit of fame, and then the crucial question, will it detract from my happiness if this fame was taken away from me? Not at all. So fame was rejected. Fame, prestige, power, I didn't have any use for that. Therefore, my paradigm began to shape itself, and I found that as I went along, it had to work for me. After having got these values, I wanted to ask myself, what were the concrete expressions for peace of mind, for purpose in life, and so on? And I alighted on two main things. Intellectual exploration. I needed the intellectual life to have peace of mind, to be happy, to have purpose. And the other thing was, of course, moral values. I wanted moral integrity. These were extremely important. In the end, I actually developed, I even had my own little holy trinity for my paradigm. And my holy trinity was truth, goodness, beauty. Truth, right? Meaning knowledge. I wanted knowledge of the scientific kind, the verifiable kind that could be empirically validated. I needed that very much to answer large existential questions that I was always asking myself. Who are we? Where did we come from? What is our place in the universe? Where did it come from? So I needed that. But I also needed values, which scientific knowledge would not give me. And therefore, I turned not to one specific religion, but to all religions. Right? I was a very greedy person, like a magpie, very selectively picking out from the various religions. As I had mentioned in my speech at the Humanist Society, I loved the Christian love or agape of Christianity, the hospitality of Islam, the compassion of Buddhism, the sensuous exuberance of Hinduism, and even the primal religions. I love them, you know, the aboriginal religions that I read about, the close affinity with nature. So gradually my paradigm took shape, and I'm just going to end very quickly because Aaron is going to ring the bell, I think. I wanted it to work for me, meaning I just wanted to have concrete applications. How would this paradigm of faith that I had constructed from the ground, independently of any religion, there was no command morality there, how would it serve me in my various roles? I was as specific as that. My role as a mother, my role as a socially active woman, as a writer, as a political commentator, as a friend. And I also wanted it to work for me in terms of providing me with sensible answers for crucial questions regarding the moral quandaries of our time. And I can think of four. I wanted to take an informed and principled stand with regard to abortion, homosexuality, euthanasia, and human cloning. So all in all then, this paradigm took me a long time to work out, but I must say that I am extremely happy about it. And in terms of the precise what, how, why, that will come in the questions later. I'm sure Aaron is looking impatiently at me, right? Thank you.
Katherine has certainly gotten down to the brass tacks, you know, and so just bear those thoughts in mind, and you can start to chew on them in a bit. There's plenty to chew on. And I just want to invite my other guest to give a sort of very short introduction about himself and things. And then we'll get down to the true conversations, okay? But I just want to say, for myself, you know, as a word of welcome, Mr. LT Jeyachandran, he's a new friend of mine, and he insists that we call him by his initials, LT. And if you're interested to know what it stands for, ask him afterwards. LT is a director at the Ravi Zacharias Ministries. It's a Christian organization, and what he does there is he is a Bible expositor, and he's actually pretty well known. He's also a keen student of culture and of comparative religions. Originally, LT comes from India, but he has lived in Singapore for a good number of years. I've had a chance to interact with him a bit, and I find it very interesting that he's knowledgeable in Greek and Hebrew as well, which apparently comes in very handy for his job. And here, before I ask him to introduce himself a little bit further, I want to say that both our speakers tonight have a couple of things in common, as far as I can tell. One is that they both love to tell stories, okay? And we want to hear those stories. We want to hear those stories because those are important in understanding why they think the way they do and why they live the way that they do. And both are charming, both are intelligent, both are very articulate. So I'm confident, in fact I'm warning all of you, that tonight we're in for a very enjoyable and thought-provoking time. So please welcome LT Jeyachandran.
As Aaron said, I'm from India. Now, India has been declared as the country with the highest number of English speakers. 350 million Indians speak 350 million types of English. So you have to first decide whether you can track my accent before we can enter into these true conversations. Now, Aaron said I should be shorter than Katherine. Now, in order to decide who is shorter or longer, you need a standard outside the two of us. We cannot manufacture our own standards. And that is one of the points on which I'm going to be majoring during this true conversations, that in order to have true meaning, you need to have a meta-narrative, a big story. Now, I'm not a story writer. My writing falls flat on my own face, and I think Katherine is a better story writer, but I do tell stories. I want to say that I was born in a reasonably religious Anglican family in southern India, but I came into a personal encounter with Christ when I was 19 years old. I was just finishing my undergraduate engineering degree, and then I went on to do a postgraduate degree, and my professors wanted me to do a PhD in engineering and get into teaching, but somehow, I think it's providential, God's will, if I may borrow a phrase from Katherine, that God took me by the scruff of my neck and threw me into a professional field. Now, in India, civil engineering is a very corrupt profession. Even tailors know which of their clients are civil engineers because they make our pockets extra large. So I was there for 28 years, 6 months and 26 days. And that was also part of my big story. I want to say something about stories, because stories have meaning only because they have a plot. They have a beginning, they have the muddle inside, whatever goes on, particularly Hindi movies, which my wife hates, which I love because you don't have to think at all. They have a very simple plot. My wife hates them because you know the end of the story within the first 5 minutes. Now, the story normally ends with the hero beating the villain black and blue, only after which the police arrive. So we generally know the outline. Of course, we are making better movies these days. But I want to say that in this particular meta-narrative, I have come to one conclusion, which of course I would elucidate as in response to other questions. I find that my personal story cannot have any ultimate meaning unless it has a transcendent story to which it is linked. And one of the reasons I'm convinced about the truth of Jesus is that his particular story, I want to say something about an Englishman who worked in my part of the country for many years. He was an intellectual. He was speaking to Indian intellectuals, and this is what he said. How do you Christians who say that sin is the universal problem of humankind, and then you go on to say that the answer to that sin is found in a particular man called Jesus, who lived in a particular time 2,000 years ago, at a particular place many thousands of kilometers from India? And that was a brilliant question, so much so that New Beginning coined a phrase called the scandal of particularity. They want to tell you that when you notice this story of God's entrance into this universe in Jesus, it is not an isolated story. It comes as part of a grand meta-narrative, which starts with the creation of this world, and why this world has gone so badly wrong, and how God intervenes in it in the person of Christ, and how he invites us to link our personal stories to this meta-narrative, so that you are able to find a meaning which is not of your own making, but at the same time you are not deprived of your freedom of being a human. Because one of the important aspects of the story is that this God, about whom I would say a few words later, made us in his image, which means he made us freely, so that we will have the freedom. In fact, before the meeting started, in my chat with Katherine, I was saying that chaos and creativity are two sides of the coin of freedom. If you restrict freedom to avoid chaos, you will find yourself restricting creativity as well. God knows this much better, and therefore his way of intervening in this world is to make sure that without our freedoms being restricted in any way, he could woo us into a relationship. And that's why this story ends also with a new creation. In other words, the meaning of my personal story, which of course I will explain as we go along, is linked to this big story. And so it's not just what I have made up, but it is what has there, which I'm able to see and live with complete intellectual integrity with this framework. And that is what I believe some of the questions that were given to both of us would be really teasing out of what both of us have said. And so I want to finish before my time, because in one place I was introduced as a speaker. I said, that is a speaker, I am a person. I think that's extremely important because, one of the reasons I find my story to be very meaningful to me is that my identity doesn't come by what I do, but by what I am. And I think Jesus helped me to discover that. Thank you.
Thanks, LT. That's also given us a lot to think about, and in particular, I am going to come back to a couple of things that you mentioned just now. One has to do with the meta-narrative, and the other has to do with intellectual integrity. Those are probably the two main avenues when we get into the bottom of whether we can get some answers to the question of what is the meaning of life. I'm just going to now explain a little bit about how we're going to conduct the rest of the evening. I should have done this earlier, I'm sorry. I'm going to basically let this be a kind of conversation between Katherine and LT, and there are some questions that I will be asking to move this along, especially if they start to get a bit long-winded, okay? So I'm doing it for your sake as well as mine. and we will just move that along, but I think as we touch on certain issues and may excite a little bit of discussion, I'll be happy for us to stay on that a little bit and to sort of plumb the depths of the views that both Katherine and LT have. And here I just want to say also that personally I'm so glad that we have both these speakers here this evening, because clearly they are speaking from experience, personal experience. They're both very clearly thoughtful people, and even better, they're able to explain the thinking process behind why they have arrived at this place in their individual journeys. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. I'm going to just pose the next question to in fact, both of you, but maybe I'll start with you, Katherine, and that is this. You mentioned just now that you spent some time constructing a framework for your belief and for your life, a kind of worldview, if you like, and it was something that was done very rigorously, and with all of your might and with all of the exploration of different philosophies and religions, and I really do admire that what you put in there. I want to ask though that because it ultimately was constructed by you, there's a fair degree of subjectivity in it. Is that a problem for you? Do you think that gives you a problem?
No problem at all. In fact, it is necessarily subjective simply because I've developed this paradigm in relation to my needs, my limitations, my goals, my background, and so on. So it's extremely subjective, and if I use it as a framework, it's always in relation to my own individual views. But as I had mentioned, as I'm sure, you know, as I was talking to you, you probably were already thinking of certain areas where we would be thinking along the same lines. Now, I ought to mention that I had begun as a Taoist. You know, I was born into a Taoist family. Then I converted to the Catholic religion at age 15, left it in my adult years because there were a few things that just didn't seem meaningful to me anymore. And then I decided that I had to construct my own schema, my own belief system to replace this. Mainly because I felt that just relying on my conscience was not good. My conscience is not at all dependable. And especially in the complex situations that we find ourselves in. You know, some of the moral quandaries that I had mentioned just now. So I needed something very clear, something so clear that I could even operationalize it. For example, if I spoke about being happy, being intellectually engaged and so on, I want to know exactly how I would do it in relation to myself, in relation to my limitations. If I spoke about my need to be a moral person, I like the idea that I'm good, how would it affect my looking upon my various roles in life? And now I'm going to give you a specific example. Where the moral qualities are concerned, I rank very, very highly. I don't even know whether you call it a moral quality. Honesty, integrity, being authentic, no pretenses and so on. Right? Just being yourself. And I found that this was very important in my handling of my political role, my role as political commentator. I do not know whether you remember that some years ago, when I annoyed the Goh Chok Tong administration with my political commentaries, he challenged me. In fact, I'm occasionally still challenged to say, get into politics or shut up. Right? You can only make valid criticism if you get into politics. And my position was no. An honest appraisal of my limitations and strengths would yield this kind of result. The only abilities I have for contributing to the Singapore situation would be speaking and writing. I would be so bad in the other areas, in the other qualities needed for political work, for field work, for example. I couldn't imagine myself, I'm a little bit eccentric and idiosyncratic, working together with people. The consensus approach would be horrible for me. I could imagine myself in the hustings, shaking hands with people who I didn't particularly like, kissing babies. Oh no, that would kill me. So I resisted that and very politely said, I will still continue with my role as a political commentator, but in this special area, though not as an armchair commentator. In other words, I shouldn't expect to be in the ivory tower to say what I like and then go back to my ivory tower. No. The stand I had to take would be an informed and principled one. In fact, before I write any commentary, I actually check, do a little checklist to say, why are you doing this? Are you doing this because you want to play up to the gallery and so on? Are you doing this because you genuinely want to get across your views? Only if I pass this self-imposed test would I dare write. So in a way, this schema, right, is very useful for me in my various roles.
Thanks. I think you made that quite clear that, I'm just going to paraphrase, in answer to my question, that it does not trouble you one bit that your worldview is subjective,
Not at all.
as long as it is informed and it is well thought through. Okay, so hold that thought. I'm going to ask the question of LT now, and LT, I think we all get it that you're a Christian. I hope I didn't get that wrong, huh? Okay. You know, is it problematic for you that the meaning that you ascribe to life is normative, that is objective?
You know, in my country, I'm still an Indian. I've not embraced any other citizenship. But one of the things I would notice, so I prefer to call myself in India as a disciple of Jesus rather than a Christian, because the word Christian, even in the Bible, was used derogatorily for the first time. And so it is not a status symbol in my country. But following Jesus is acceptable because Jesus is respected, although people's views of Jesus differ, of course. What I want to say is that in my understanding of the God revealed to us by Jesus, I find that there is a very interesting mix of the objective and the subjective. Because you find that in relationships, although I also don't like to kiss babies on hustings, the whole idea of relationship involves something in which you are involved. I am, for those of you who may be philosophy students, let me make a comment here. I'm so happy to be here. I feel like returning to your university and do some studies, but probably I will be disqualified. But one of the things that you notice if you are a philosophy student, you might be familiar with the name of Michael Polanyi, who was actually a Hungarian refugee in Britain, who was a physical chemist, and who wrote this book, Personal Knowledge. It was published first in 1958 and has been continuously in print. And Polanyi made this point about knowledge, that there is nothing which is purely objective. And that is why when scientists say that this is purely an objective fact, they are making a fundamental difference, because no evidence is self-interpreting. You see an evidence through a pair of spectacles, and you see an evidence and you come to three different conclusions. I often think of three people who watched a ship sink. The humanist said, what a loss of life. The materialist said, what a loss of property. The physicist said, how beautifully the law of gravity works. This is the same evidence, but interpreted in three different ways by people wearing three different pairs of glasses. And that is why when we talk about verifiability, although we can be, and I'm a scientist, I'm not talking as a philosopher, and this is a philosopher-scientist who for the first time brought to the notice of the world. In fact, I understand that probably more in the US than in Europe, you have Polanyi societies in philosophy departments, which actually make it clear that knowledge has both an objective and a subjective dimension. It turns on an objective-subjective axis. But I tell you why I can hold this with absolute intellectual integrity is because the God whom Jesus revealed was also a God of relationships. And interestingly, Jesus did not name the persons of the Godhead with proper nouns, like our Roman, Greek, or Hindu friends would say, but rather as Father and Son, so that the relationship, the identity, was relational, and therefore, wherever, I mean, although it was objective, it had a subjective relational idea. In fact, there is a verse in the Bible which says, it's only the Father who knows the Son, and the Son who knows the Father. So you find that knowledge itself becomes relational, and therefore the objective and the subjective are combined. Now you must know that you can go to two extremes on this. You can go to a purely objective where you make up your own meaning, but I would personally say that that is no meaning at all. The word meaning itself means that there is a universal intent, that we all have the same idea we put into that word, and therefore you cannot use a word like meaning and say, it is my meaning. If I were to speak English like that, you will never understand what I'm saying, because I'm putting my meaning into it. I've often felt that free thinking, which is a very legitimate group, has a slight philosophical problem about it. Because if you are totally free, you should even be free of English rules, grammar, syntax, and diction. So much so that you cannot say I'm free. You can only groan or grunt. by being able to say I'm free, I have to relate to the language of English, to its rules. So you find that the whole of life, therefore, comes down to relationships, and which applies to epistemology, to knowledge. So I cannot know something except by relating to it. If I were a scientist, a physicist, conducting an experiment, I am designing the experiment. I am constructing the apparatus. I am recording the results. I come to an experiment with a preconceived idea, which me and my other colleagues in the scientific community put up. So you find that there is a subjective dimension, but it doesn't deny the reality of the objective fact that I'm investigating. So one of the things that you have to begin to realize, that truth and knowledge are relational and therefore have to be both subjective and objective. And Michael Polanyi therefore rejected the empiricism of Britain, where he lived most of his life, objectivism, and at the same time he was very clear that this was not something of his own construct, that it is something to which he could relate, but with universal intent. Of course, universal intent is a phrase I'm borrowing from Leslie Newbigin. And so what I want to submit to you, and I will relate it to my faith later as Aaron leads us on in this discussion. So I do not think that the reason why I can hold this faith with complete intellectual integrity, because it realistically combines the objective and the subjective. And therefore I am able to at least give good reasons why other people can embrace the same belief system. Because they could bring their own contribution to it, but without violating that freedom, they can relate to a truth which has been displayed so clearly in history.
Okay. I saw somebody taking notes. Yeah, that's quite a good idea. Okay, well, in the interest of getting the gloves off, because we've heard really now what LT thinks of a subjective, what he terms to be a predominantly subjective worldview. I'm going to ask Katherine, what in your view is the main trouble with normative worldviews like Christianity or take religion?
No trouble, no trouble. I'm an eclectic person. I love hybrid belief systems. I love diversity. So no problem at all, except that I think one of the highest values I have in my little paradigm is tolerance. Right? So you tolerate the other person's point of view, as LT has mentioned. Right? There will always be a great deal of subjectivity. Now, on the point of objectivity that LT has mentioned, it is an important thing for me. I had mentioned earlier that I'm a passionate seeker of knowledge. I want to know what is out there. I don't want any religion or wisdom tradition to say the earth was created so many years ago and so on. I say, hey, I want to know what really happened. Now, obviously, you know, there is no sure way of doing that, but I rely on objective truth in the sense of instrumentally verified truth. Instrumentally verified means, well, the Hubble telescope, for example, right? It comes back with pictures that everybody can see about the birth of stars, as I said, the death of planets and so on, which I love because it will contribute to my perception of the beginning of the universe. I want to know what the scientists mean when they say the Big Bang occurred 13 billion years ago. I also want to know, right, what the evolutionary psychologists or the evolutionary scientists mean when they say, you know, this evolution took place in this. I say, I want to see instrumental evidence. Neuroscientists, I love neuroscience because I think ultimately everything goes back to the brain. Right? They have got these fantastic electron microscopes, is that right? Where you can actually see things that are invisible. The cell, for example. So all these truths which have surfaced because of the wonders of science, scientific technology, I'm extremely happy about, and this is in fact a source of great happiness for me. The pursuit of knowledge, right, on the understanding, hey, there's a lot of things going out there that we can all agree on, but as LT has said, a great deal of subjectivity. In fact, even among the scientists, there's very little agreement on for example, certain aspects of the Big Bang. Right? But I'm extremely happy to be living at an age when you can actually have instrumental validation.
Thank you. That was very clear. Any response to that, LT?
In fact, I think I did mention the problem with instrumental validation, because I said that there are millions of facts lying around. When scientists want to investigate something, they are using their hunch, in a sense, to see which of those facts are significant. And then when they start investigating that fact, they are designing the instrument. And therefore we must remember, that's why my story about the ship sinking is probably an exaggerated version of the fact that all of us bring different paradigms to interpret certain things. But at the same time, this is why I said there has to be an objectivity combined with a necessary subjectivity. You know, I often think of another Indian story, particularly when we who follow Christ, we say that Christ is the only way. We get this story from our Hindu friends, and it's a brilliant story. Only Indians can tell brilliant stories, by the way. No slur on Katherine. And in this story, this happened in Varanasi, Banaras, where 6 blind men touched 6 different parts of the elephant, and they drew 6 different conclusions. And therefore, the idea is when we talk something about God, we are actually touching different parts of a great reality. I can't disagree with that. And therefore, these are all 6 different perspectives on God. Now, there is a problem with that. The problem is, if these 6 blind people had a committee meeting after touching the elephant, would they have drawn the conclusion there is one whole elephant out there? They could not have. The only one who knows that there is an elephant out there is one who has sight. And the person who's telling me the story is also blind. And therefore, I do not know how we know that there is an elephant out there. So ultimately, therefore, we come to the conclusion there is need for revelation. Somebody with sight has to tell us what is out there. So that's my first problem. There's my second problem is that about this whole issue of, one of the things that Katherine mentioned was, what did you say about instrumentality, and what was your second point, Katherine? Because I
moral purpose.
Huh?
Moral purpose?
No, not moral purpose. It was something else which I thought we could look at the other aspect. I'll come to that, maybe. I'm sure this will pop up later. But I feel that in the whole pursuit, therefore, of meaning, we are looking at different areas. You use the word tolerance. You know, as an engineer, I felt tolerance is not the best word, because tolerance means departure from the norm. See, in engineering, when we say a pipe shaft should be plus or minus 0.1 mm, we mean that it's missed the actual diameter by 0.1 millimeter. And tolerate is a very condescending word. I tolerate you, Aaron. It's not the best way to speak in public, because I'm speaking down to him. I prefer the word respect. In fact, it's a word which is used in the Bible, which means that when I dialogue with people, I respect them even when I disagree with them. I do not have to say what you say is true and what I say is true as well. Because truth is not to be confused with taste. Because when Bertrand Russell was asked in that famous debate with the Jesuit priest, how do you differentiate between right and wrong? He said, we differentiate it the same way as between blue and green. But you differentiate between colors by your preference for a particular color. But you can't differentiate between moral values on the basis of your preference. So truth cannot be a matter of taste. I prefer it this way. Truth, therefore, exists outside of you. And the problem with that kind of a truth is it gives me only an objective understanding. But unless I come into a subjective relationship with that truth, it cannot really begin to influence my life. That's basically my point.
Okay. I think we now moved a little bit closer to realizing that for both of these speakers, the human mind plays a very important role in how you come to your worldview, how you derive the meaning of your life, and then how you live as a consequence of what you believe. So I'm going to pose you a question. I don't know whether this is going to take you by surprise, I hope so. What kind of meaning of life can a person who's severely mentally disabled have? How can a person make sense of the world around him and of his condition in the world? We'll start with Katherine.
Well, according to my paradigm. A person who is mentally disabled, will be unable to have the kind of happiness that I mentioned, right? He will not be able to have any meaningful intellectual pursuit. But I say that if he does not have meaning, other people can confer meaning on him. Those who are close to him, his family, can give him the kind of happiness that he's not capable of getting himself. So a disabled person is still entitled to the kind of happiness I mentioned. I'm sure that there must be ways and means by which he can achieve that measure of fulfillment, that measure of self-identity and so on that other people value. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to follow up on that point a little bit. So, a person who's unable to derive any meaning to his own existence due to his own condition can nevertheless find happiness and that meaning if other people around him, society and family and so on, help him with that.
Yes.
Okay. I think we want to come into this point because I'm going to ask a question about does the world do that? Does society do that? Are we basically good to one another? Okay, and that's also a basic philosophical problem, but we'll come to that. What about you, LT? What kind of meaning can a severely mentally disabled person derive for his own life?
I want to link my answer with what Katherine said in her earlier reply, which I think was very interesting, about the whole issue of the brain, the neurosciences. I think one of the famous neuroscience atheists of today is Dr. Sam Harris, who has 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and the other in neuroscience. He has written a book called The Moral Landscape, which is for a follower of Christ a highly disturbing book, because he actually says that you can analyze your neural behavior and say that when you take a right decision, this is how your brain works, these are the hormones which secrete, and therefore you do not need an outside framework. Your own brain kind of dictates it. I have a couple of approaches to that point, before which I come to this. With your permission, let me do that. The first point is that, suppose I get angry with my wife, and she says, "Why are you angry?" And if I said, "It is because a certain hormone was secreted in excess," she would probably tell me, "Be reasonable." Which means that, while it is true that there is this hormone, there seems to be something which is riding on that hormone, which is greater than that hormone, and which I have the capacity to control. Otherwise, I would be nothing more than pure chemistry. In fact, of those of us who are somewhat older, might have seen this movie Contact, starring Jodie Foster, which was dedicated to Carl Sagan, because Carl Sagan died in 1996. He was a famous professor of astronomy in Cornell University, but he was also an atheist. He said, man is nothing but molecules in motion. And so when he died, his wife, who was also an atheist, stood by his coffin and said, "This is a molecular machine which has broken down." Now, I do not know what their marriage was like. I don't know whether Mr. Sagan ever told Mrs. Sagan, "I love you." He might have said, "I feel a chemical reaction." I want to give a very Indian example to meaning. We have plenty of illiteracy in our country, but some of our illiterate people are good painters. Suppose I ask one of them to paint a no parking sign, and he brings it, and if he says this is paint on metal, he'll be stating the truth. Same as Carl Sagan will be very correct if he says we are molecules in motion. But if that painter should say this is nothing but paint on metal, he is actually going beyond the purview of his own knowledge. He does not know that a crossed out P has a meaning which an illiterate painter will not be able to establish, because it requires a vantage point above that of a pure painter, of someone who owns a vehicle and who knows traffic rules. And therefore the nothing but is what causes the problem. And therefore when you talk about neuroscientists, now let me give you another example. You can explain completely how this watch works. I'm not a watchmaker. But that does not tell you that the watch is made for the purpose of telling time. The whole question of meaning hinges on that. So if I can completely neuroanalyze and analyze myself biochemically, I'm doing a lot of good for the health and welfare systems. But I'm not coming any closer to the question of meaning. Because meaning rides on something more. Now let me come to the whole issue of disabled people, although it is a very sad thing. One of the things I want to particularly refer to what Katherine said. She was saying very often, I. But now when it came to the neurally disabled people, she began to say we. And I think the transfer from I to we becomes very significant because we are not by ourselves. We are not islands. We are related to each other. And therefore the whole issue that in order to find meaning, we need to find true community. And the God in whom I have come to believe is himself a community, which is why he's creating us as a community and calling the redeemed people as a community, which is why the church is never a denomination, never a bureaucracy, never a structure. It's always people, as it is used in the Bible, that word. And so when it comes to, in any way, people who are physically, mentally challenged, it immediately raises the whole issue of my responsibility as a member of the community. And so the ultimate reason why I should do that, is it because of an inborn altruism that I experience? Or is it because of the external reality of a God who himself is a community and who made me and all of us in his image to display that community? And when I find someone who is challenging it this way, that I must step out and begin to help that person, it becomes very interesting. And I'll give you one personal anecdote. This was with a medical doctor, a good friend of mine who passed away, who was India's one of the top neurosurgeons. He was also a Christian. He and I were speaking at a medical conference in one corner of India. And the gentleman who was one of the organizers was a civil servant. And his oldest girl, I think, was born with cerebral palsy. And so she was not able to relate to her parents. And of course, this was a matter of great heartache to the parents. So he took us, because my colleague was a neuroscientist and a neurosurgeon, for his advice. So he gave them some practical advice of how to look after her. And then he made a statement, which I think only a follower of Christ can make so confidently. He said, and probably that will answer your question, Aaron, more directly. He said, we are unhappy that this girl cannot relate to us, but it's quite possible that she may have a greater consciousness of God because she is incapable of having other knowledge. That is an amazing insight, because those of us who have dealt with people who are visually handicapped, you notice that some of their other sensories pick up very strongly. So we do not know, but I think that is a distinct possibility which this amazing medical doctor opened up for us to think about.
Well, I'll say it's a possibility, but it's not verifiable, is it? I mean, are we just saying that to make ourselves feel better? You know what I mean? Because I think you agree with Katherine what she said, that people have a responsibility to one another. The question is, does it make it, why do we have a sense of responsibility to one another? Is it because God tells us so? Or because of our own accord, we see that there are particular needs to help other people achieve the happiness that we ourselves want? I think that might be something that I want to ask you to address.
In fact, I did mention it that in passing, there is an inborn altruism in every human being. Let's admit that. I mean, I'll be happy, more than happy to admit that because of humans being made in the image of God, I think natural goodness is something that I would heartily affirm, because what the Bible goes on to say is that goodness is not enough to save us. That's a different problem. But failure to recognize this goodness will be totally blind on the part of any follower of Christ. So I would definitely affirm that. But the whole problem is, are all people equally good? And that is where I have a problem. And that is where I have a problem about measuring humanism by human beings. I would also call myself a humanist in one way. I hope, Katherine, you won't object. But I am a Christian humanist because I believe that humans are made to reflect the image of God. Because when I am a non-Christian humanist, I open up a whole problem. Which human being is my standard? Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Adolf Hitler, Mother Teresa? I mean, you have a whole range of people. So, which human being becomes my standard? See, that is the real problem when you begin to define human goodness. So, my view is that when you and I are made to resemble God in certain moral characteristics, however marred they may be, you are able to see the reason why we do have that goodness. But to make, therefore, human beings themselves as a standard for goodness is a dangerous exercise in my view.
Could I respond to that? Yes. Could I respond to that? Yes. You use the word altruism, and that is probably because it is derived from some divine origin. God made you to His image, and so loving each other. Now, well, I look at it slightly differently within a naturalistic framework. Even qualities like empathy and so on that we attach very lofty moral labels to, including altruism. It seems to me that these qualities had developed over a long time, even in the world of mammals. Right? And through our long period of evolution, it developed probably because of group survival. And I'm going to give you an example that I love because it is just so amazing. Altruism among bats. Of course, we wouldn't use the word altruism for bats. Do you know that bats actually help each other? You know, a bat, in order to stay alive, needs blood within 24 hours. Right? And if the bat is sickly and unable to do so, its companions do this, or they go, and then they regurgitate the blood in order to keep the bat alive. And we have heard lots and lots of stories in the animal world of examples of, well, you would call it kindness, you would call it love, of course, right, in human terms. But this is actually to project our human emotions. So it seems to me that before religion there was morality, before morality there was this primitive need for survival, where you actually had to develop qualities for helping each other in order to survive at all. And I brought up the bat example because it's just so amazing. You know, bats have fantastic memory. They remember those that have helped them, and they actually don't do that kind of favor for those bats that have been selfish. To me, that's just amazing, almost the beginnings of a moral system among creatures that we don't rate very highly in terms of the intellect.
So Katherine, you think that there is natural goodness in every person, but you deny that it has divine origin. It is more evolved from a certain higher order need for the safety, security, and prosperity of the society.
For the survival of the group, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
May I address that? Because there was an interesting experience I had in India. That was an open forum, but for professionals, where during the course of my talk, I had probably made a statement that human beings are above the rest of nature, which is really what we are coming to. And one of my own colleagues was in the audience. He was a member of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. And he said, LT, how can you say that humans are above the rest of nature? Because we now know that animals have a sense of pain. And you know, some species of monkeys are strictly monogamous and so on and so forth. And dogs can indicate guilt when they disobey their master and so on. So how can you say this? So I told him, and that was the time when India had launched our first project Tiger to keep the tigers from extinction. I said, I as a human being, when I look at a tiger, I know that the tiger can harm me, and still I feel obliged to protect him. But when the tiger looks at me, his sentiments are very different. He considers me as potential lunch. Now, how do you explain the difference? If human beings are not above the tigers of this world, in other words, I would think the other way around, because you yourself mentioned that, Katherine, the theory of evolution works on the survival of the fittest. And Woody Allen is a great philosopher who lives and works in Hollywood. And in one movie he says the whole universe looks to me like a giant restaurant where X eats W and Y eats X and Z eats Y and they live happily ever after. But I think when you come as human beings, we feel that we should help the weak, which seems to go against the evolutionary instinct of the survival of the fittest. And that is something that goes against the very thread of this. So I believe, therefore, that there is something in humans which could be seen. I'm not denying at all one bit an element of sentience in animals, but to make that the source of a kind of standard for morality evolving from below. Let me give you another example. I even feel that in a purely evolutionary scale, you cannot say that humans are an improvement on the monkey. Because to say that, you should have a standard outside of humans and the monkey, and humans come closer to that standard than the monkey. Because in evolution, there is no outside standard. So all that you can say is that humans are different from the monkey. We can't say that we are an improvement on the monkey. Because we are an improvement on the monkey, probably Christians can say, because we say that humans are made in the image of God. So we come closer to God than the monkey. But when there is no God, then all that you can say is that humans are different from the monkey. Why? Monkeys can even have a conference and decide that they will not evolve into humans because humans are so bad. I would be surprised.
Well, I think although I personally feel that, you know, saying that there is a certain common good that a society is always evolving towards, and it develops its own rules, known and unknown, to help the society as a whole prosper, is different from actually saying that that moral value was given by a divine being. Wouldn't you agree?
Sorry, I was a little bit, could you repeat? I was thinking, you know, regarding his story.
Yeah. Well, I was just commenting on what LT was just saying, that, you know, yes, we don't know why precisely individuals in a society help others, sometimes at their own cost. But I think it's a bit of a step too far to say that because of that, we can see that there is a divine moral value imposed on the society.
Yeah, that was exactly my stand, right? To say the starting point, you know, my starting point is always from the known to the unknown, rather than from the unknown to the known. That's something that had been in the books for 2,000 years, and then you look at the present situation in relation to that. Now, I think a very useful starting point is simply survival. Life is here to survive, to reproduce itself. Right? And they do it at the individual level, they do it at the group level, and as a result, you have even in the animal world helping each other. You know, it's wonderful. I've seen programs on elephants. They go to each other's rescues, wonderful whales and so on, alerting each other. You know, wonderful programs on the Animal Planet. Yes. Right? So it seems to me that over long periods of time, these very qualities that are useful for survival have remained, right? All those qualities about helpfulness, even it seems negative qualities, envy, jealousy, and so on, that are part of our world, probably have adaptive value. That's why they're still around. Right? So I tend to have this kind of a stand, which seems to me more easily supported by evidence around, rather than to say as a starting point, you know, there is a divinity, this is how he has made us, therefore everything else follows. I would be more comfortable with the first naturalistic framework. Okay.
So would you then describe yourself as an evolutionist, and if so, what are humans evolving towards?
Oh, I'm not so sure about it. LT was right and you're right. You know, not evolving towards something. Certainly, the whole concept of perfectibility and improvability has not been built. We simply adapt. We simply adapt. How do you know in the next 2,000 years there could be conditions that could be a real throwback to the situation maybe 1,000,000 years ago? So it's just adapting and surviving. And you actually see examples of that in the animal world right now. You see virus, for example, adapting in such a way that the antibiotics right, would no longer work for them. You see evolution all the time, except that in our case, suppose it takes such a long time, you don't really see it. But back again to my main point, I like to understand things in terms of a naturalistic framework, right? So that I can look at evidence from so many disciplines, biology, evolutionary science, physics for that matter, and so on, rather to have a starting point from which I cannot deviate, right? This is what it is according to some holy book, therefore it must be so, and therefore whatever evidence you find must be adapted to suit it. Now that would be a little bit unacceptable to me.
Thanks. I think that's very clearly put. Well, what about you, LT? Do you see survival as a moral imperative, and if so, where does that come from?
You know, in fact, I would probably suggest to Katherine whether she's willing to consider another alternative. Now, when I speak from a Christian perspective, it is not that I am denying the reality of the natural, because there are philosophies which are purely spiritual, which will say that the material itself is illusion. There was one Indian philosopher who used to say everything is illusion. He lived in the 8th, 9th centuries, was the writer of one of the famous schools of philosophy, which I think in all philosophy departments, Advaita Vedanta. Shankara said everything is illusion, which means he was denying the reality of the physical world, purely spiritual. The story is told that he was having his bath in a river when a rogue elephant came to chase him. And he climbed a tree and stayed on the tree till the elephant went away. And when he came down, his disciples came and said, "Sir, you said everything was an illusion. Why did you run away from the elephant?" And his brilliant answer was, the elephant is an illusion, my running away is an illusion, everything is an illusion. So you can have a spiritual view which denies the reality of the material world. But suppose I were to give you a perspective of the spiritual which also explains the material and integrates it with the spiritual. Like, for example, the understanding of human creation by God is taking matter and breathing into his own life when the first human being comes into existence, which means we are both material and non-material. And the example, one more example that comes to me from C.S. Lewis is that he says, and which explains even animal behavior. Suppose this building is on fire, and all of us have the instinct of self-preservation, and so we try to escape. And even as we are escaping, we are hearing the cry of a baby. So we have the other instinct to go and help others. But that's not all. You hear a third voice which arbitrates between the two instincts and tells you which instinct you should suppress and which instinct you should obey. That cannot be an instinct itself. That, I think, is really what distinguishes humans from animals. I believe that that is really what. So you need a view of reality which has two levels of explanation, both the spiritual and the material. Not the one which will have purely material, which is why I do not believe in a purely materialist view, nor in a purely spiritualist view, which is a totally disembodied existence. That is not what Christianity is. In fact, I remember speaking to a Christian group here, a worship group, about new creation. And I said, what do you think of the new creation? We will all be floating around like ghosts, holding invisible guitars with intangible strings, producing inaudible music, because we are so non-material. And if Christians have given that view, I'm afraid that that is really not biblical. Because the Bible combines the material with the spiritual, and it's so central to our understanding, which equips you for this life and the life to come. And I think the last two chapters of the Bible are not heaven, it's the new heavens and the new earth, which means we come back to inhabit a renewed creation and continue the work which we have now botched up.
I'm depressed now. I want to ask both of you this question, and both of you have touched on this, and that's the question of conscience. Catherine, you mentioned that you cannot in good conscience accept something as a moral imperative unless you have found it to be reasonable, that it was well thought through, and best of all, that it wasn't just imposed on you, lock, stock, and barrel, but you've arrived at it through your own experience and negotiating the meaning of it. And LT, you also mentioned about this conscience, and that was the third voice that sort of arbitrated between the two instincts that you had, to flee or to save the baby. Well, so I'm glad we both can agree on this, that there is such a thing as conscience. And I think now the question, of course, is who owns that conscience? Whose conscience is it? You have any other further thoughts to share on that?
Oh, I'm not even sure I know how to answer your question. Who owns the conscience? Yeah. What do you mean?
Or where does it come from?
Or where did it come from, right? Now again, you know, I suppose my starting point will always be from the ground, spontaneously, not from above, right? The conscience, as you grow up, there are certain values you are exposed to, there are certain things that you say that your parents tell you are right or wrong. You evolve a system as you go along. But let me give you a very concrete example of how I cannot really rely on my conscience for a certain issue. Remember, I had mentioned certain moral quandaries in our time, abortion and so on. Now, I was a Catholic, right, which would make abortion a crime, a mortal sin. And I felt that in order to approach the whole issue in an informed and principled way, I had to have knowledge. And so I decided to do this. I said, I've just got to take a principled stand. How do I do that? According to the Catholic Church, for example, I speak from this because I have had experience of this. The minute the sperm meets the egg, already God has implanted an immortal soul made to his image, right? So abortion at this stage would be a mortal sin. Now, I find that completely unacceptable from the humanitarian point of view. Right? For example, I prefer a stand taken based on knowledge from science. I would like to know at what point in the development of the fetus sentience sets in. Sentience means capacity for feeling pain, right? Because if the fetus is capable of feeling pain at 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, that fetus is already a human being, a sentient being, that is entitled to protection under human rights. Because even animals, chickens, by law are protected under animal rights. So I like it that I am observing the scientists, even though they don't agree on exactly when sentience takes place. Some of them say 2.5 months, 4 months. It doesn't matter to me. But the fact that you honestly argue it out, you argue it out independently, transparently, right, and you reach a certain agreement, for me, that is far more reassuring than to say, sorry, according to this religion, that religion, it is already a sin, right? Which means, and I'm going to give you an example of a heartbreaking case. There was a girl in Ireland not too long ago who became pregnant as a result of a brutal rape, right? Now, according to the Catholic Church, which is very strong in Ireland, you cannot have abortion, of course. So the mother took her to some country where abortion was legal. When she came back, the church excommunicated her. Now, to me, that is absolutely unconscionable. I can't bear to think that abstract doctrine can ever be more important than real human need. Right? And for this reason, I don't even need to go into it. For this reason, I'm very upset by the Catholic Church's cover-up, systematic cover-up of something that I think is the most atrocious crime on earth, pedophilia. But that's another matter which we will not talk about.
Thank you. That was very forcefully put and give us a great deal to think about. LT?
You know, my response, I think probably even my answer to the previous question raises the whole issue of sentience. Because if sentience could be located at a particular point of time in the fetus's life, then you will be reducing it to the purely physical. You know, in fact, let me put 4 questions to you. for you to think about, including to Katherine. Now, I'm not too arrogant person, because I don't want to put it to you because you'll lengthen the proceedings. You see, I am looking at 4 unbridgeable gaps. I mean, Richard Dawkins, of course, was a strong evolutionist, says that Christians are notorious for positing the God of the gaps. Every time there's a gap in knowledge, you put God there, and as knowledge increases, the gap shrinks, and the God of the gaps also shrinks. So I don't believe in the God of the gaps. But I believe in 2 types of gaps. Gaps in quality and gaps in quantity. Gaps of a kind, gaps of degree. Ontological gaps, epistemological gaps. That is, gaps by very nature. And so it brings up 4 important questions to me. One is the first gap, which I think to which even Katherine subscribed from what you said. How does something come from nothing? The Big Bang, for example. We all agree that Big Bang is a small, not all Christians believe in Big Bang, but as a Christian, I don't think Big Bang is such a bad thing, because we now know that the universe came out of nothing spontaneously. Came by nothing, for nothing, and there's a kind of a Gettysburg Address of by nothing, for nothing, through nothing. Okay. Now, and physicists agree that the known laws of physics break down at the point of the Big Bang, which means that the physical knowledge that I have now will never be able to tell me how the world came into existence. So I have the first question: how does something come from nothing? My second question: how does life come from non-life? Now, in school, textbooks, we used to have the Urey-Miller experiment. In an organic solution, you pass electricity and you sap bacteria, but that's no longer taught, because the gap between inorganic and organic chemistry is something that has puzzled the chemists. The third question: how does reason come from non-reason? When students at universities ask me questions on evolution, I normally do not answer because I'm not a biologist, but I raise a philosophical issue here. I normally ask the student to keep standing, and I say, did you use your reason to ask me this question? He would say yes. Do you expect me to use my reason to give you a reasonable answer to your reasonable question? He will say yes. And I would say, if evolution is true, where did your reason come from? Because of a lightning which hit the South China Sea, a laptop washed ashore near our house on East Coast. Now, if a laptop washes ashore like that, will I ever depend upon it? I depend upon computers because its hardware was designed by reasonable people. Its software was written by reasonable people. Reason comes from reason at every stage. And the fourth gap, interestingly, is how does morality come from pure rationality? And here you have a good quote from Kai Nielsen. Kai Nielsen is a Canadian atheist who is quoted actually by Dr. Ravi Zacharias in his book, Can Man Live Without God? He argues from a philosophical point of view that rationality does not necessarily contribute to morality. Because morality is an ought law, rationality is an is law. And so I fully agree with whatever Katherine says when it comes to the physical world, but the moment you say you ought to behave like this, you are introducing a prescriptive law, not a descriptive law like the law of gravity, which simply describes how nature operates. So confusion between descriptive and prescriptive laws can result in huge problems. So I believe, therefore, that something has to come from someone, and therefore someone has to pre-exist.
Okay. I'm going to just ask you both this question now. How does your meaning of life guide you in determining what you ought or not ought to do in any given situation?
Yes, sorry, are you addressing?
Yes. Ladies first.
As I've said, my paradigm is completely independent of any religion. It's something that I've worked out, and it's very, very down to earth. It's very pragmatic. It has got no reference to any hereafter. And the basic questions are actually so simple, right? I'm doing something. Am I harming anybody? As basic as that. I don't even need to know anything beyond that. I'm going to do this. am I harming anybody? To be more precise, in thought, word, or deed. Now, deed, I'm okay, you know, but thought, a word, you know, am I saying something that could be hurtful to a person? In thought, am I judging somebody unfairly? So these are little kinds of guides that I have for myself. They work well for me. I don't know whether they work well for anybody, but in the end, I think you decide on what works best for you in terms of your own temperament, your own limitations. So I've drawn up this, and as I mentioned earlier, to be very specific, I use the day as a unit to say, okay, today, right, I'm going to have contact, right, I'm going in a taxi, I'm going to do this kind of transaction, that with total strangers. What should I do, number one, that will not be harmful? Even better. So it's even better that don't do to others what you don't want to do to others to do to you. I want to give it a positive spin because it makes me feel good. I suppose self-interest. It makes me feel good and happy to say, do to others what you would like others to do to you. And it's so concrete, you know, I say, oh, today I'm going into a taxi. I make sure that I don't do anything that is rude or discourteous. I'm at this conference now. I want to make sure I don't say anything that is insincere or pretentious and so on. It has to be honest, even if you don't agree with me. That's okay. So, using that little, simple, stunningly mundane framework, you actually can get by in this very complicated world.
Thank you. LT?
Oh, I would totally agree with Katherine, except to say that I have an additional problem which she may not have. I know what is right. I have a problem doing what I know is right. I find that there is something in me which seems to operate exactly opposite to what I know is right. Whether I start with the mundane or with the divine, I have the same problem, and this is a problem I think we all share with one another, probably not with monkeys, I'm not sure. But I think all humans of all religions, I think we have a problem. This is one of the things I remember telling a Muslim friend in a meeting in Bombay, that we can all sit together, humanists, atheists, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and from our religions and philosophies, we can take down the highest codes of ethics and put them down, and then we would realize that we have a huge problem. The problem is not that we do not know what is right and what is wrong. The problem is that we do not have always the power to do what is right and stop doing what we know is wrong. In other words, there seems to be a system, a paradigm that's working within me which pulls me downwards. I cannot lift myself up by my own bootstraps. And I think that is the reality. And I want to tell you that the reason why my decision to follow Jesus has become meaningful to me is because he deals with that first. Because this golden rule was also quoted by Jesus. But before he quoted the golden rule, you should love your neighbor as yourself, he quoted a more fundamental rule, that you should love God with all your heart. Because unless you come to God, you will not find it so easy to love the unlovable. As long as you are in the midst of a fairly decent, lovable society, like you have in Singapore, it is easy to love others. You come to India, where our traffic actually suggests a verse in the Bible, we walk by faith and not by sight. You do not know how to love the unlovable. So that is the most basic problem against which all standards of morality have to struggle and come up with an answer.
Okay, both of you have mentioned this golden rule, and you know, I know some people say it's found in almost every civilization, every time, and each of you have given some pretty cogent reasons why your worldview justifies this golden rule. You don't have a problem with it. Can I just ask though, from your observation of the way that the world is now, do you see any hope for human beings, whether they're applying the golden rule, you know, or not, for every human being to live a meaningful and happy life?
Oh, I don't know whether my answer is going to make sense. I tried to puzzle this out, you know. And my starting point, I love starting points, and then you go from there to see how strong your argument becomes. My starting point, and I think you might have to agree with me, is this. I need a factual starting point, and it is this. All of us operate from self-interest, whether you like it or not. We all act from self-interest, and we go from there. At every level, from the individual to the community, to the nation, to the world, and to the planet. If there's a galactic war, for example, our planet will be acting from self-interest. Now, and again, this is linked, we go back to survival and so on. But because we live in a community and we need to survival, this self-interest has to be moderated. It has to work in tandem with the needs of the community. Which is why I think the whole history of life, of civilization, has been one of competition and cooperation. You just need these 2 points to understand what is happening in the world. Everybody acts from self-interest, but when it serves you to cooperate, you do so. When it doesn't, you don't. You see it happening all the while. At the individual level, sibling rivalry, for example, at the community level, at the level of warfare. Everybody acts from self-interest, and if it serves our purpose, we cooperate. But as soon as it doesn't serve our purpose to cooperate, we go back to competition. Self-interest, cooperation, and competition. And it seems to me, if you understand this, it clarifies a whole lot of things, right? In fact, if you examine some of the words used for morality, they are all based, you know, on one side or the other. The good words to describe people, to describe good moral behavior, all have to do with cooperation. Kind, helpful, courteous, and then the rest, aggressive, implacable, and so on. I think this is probably a very simplistic view of looking at things, but it helps me understand things. And so back to your question, Aaron, am I optimistic? I don't know. You know, sometimes I think the world is just on the edge of disaster. But then there have been many instances of history where the world was on the brink of disaster, nuclear war, and then they pulled back. Why did they pull back? Probably, again, the instinct for survival. You all need to survive, the Cuban crisis and so on. That is when the instinct for survival kicks in, and you have no choice but to cooperate. But you never cooperate because you love that other side. You cooperate because you love yourself. I know this is a very bleak view of human nature, but probably a very realistic one.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, LT, are you similarly bleak and optimistic?
You know, I'll tell you something. You know, when I look around the world, I see 4 possible ways of evaluating it. The first one, is it an all good world? I think even the best optimist would not say this is an all good world. Is it an all bad world? I think even the worst pessimist would not say that. In fact, during my days in the Indian government, I had a friend who was such a pessimist that we had a joke about him. Mr. Agarwal cannot see anything positive, even in a plus sign. I do not know whether you have come across such pessimists. But you will not say that the world is an absolutely bad world. Then there's a third option in which people believed about 100 years ago. It's a bad world which is progressively becoming better and ultimately will become perfect, because that was the time when industry was in full flow, medicines were being discovered, then we had the print media, radio, TV, and so on. But the First World War, the Second World War, and then Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you reach the middle of the last century, people reach the fourth conclusion. It is a good world which at some critical point has gone bad. Which, interestingly, is what the Bible says. So it's not an all good world, it's not an all bad world, it's not a good world which will progressively become utopian, but it is a good world which has gone bad. Which is why we have these very interesting combinations. We can find the good. In fact, I don't disagree with Katherine, except that the starting point is a big problem. In the world of physics, the one who was really working towards the starting point was Stephen Hawking. He said, I am going to discover the theory of everything, which he abandoned. You know, the interesting point is, the theory of everything has to explain why you want to discover the theory of everything. And you are part of the show. How can you ever have a starting point which is within the show? It has to come from outside. So this is simply the point. I want to tell you, Rumors of Transcendence is a good book which is on the market by Philip Yancey. Rumors of Transcendence. It's all over the place. And maybe if Aaron should ask me a question later, I'll say why God doesn't make himself more obvious. But I'm just saying that he's giving us plenty of evidences that there are realities here which are constantly suggesting to you that you are not going to find the answer from within the system. However good the system is and however bad the system is. You asked me for the prognosis. I remember a brilliant cartoon from Punch magazine. Punch was a British humorist magazine which existed for almost 200 years and then closed down because of want of money. And it was, and one of our Indian newspapers used to print cartoons, and it's a brilliant cartoon. The scene is one of our cities, modern skyscraper cities, in moldering ruins after a nuclear holocaust. And in the foreground, there are a few sheep, and one sheep is telling another, I think we have inherited the earth. And I think it is a beautiful way of depicting how mere brute strength is not going to help. There has to be death at some point before there is life. Aslan has to die. The ring has to be destroyed. Even Harry Potter dies and rises again. Now, these are because we are beginning to see that this is not an upward journey forever. It has to start with a downward step at some point. Before we can move upwards, there is going to be hope, and there is place for looking up. I believe so.
Okay, people. So this is where we're not going to let them off so easy, okay? We're going to take a very short break for you to stay where you are, okay? And put your questions, your burning, pressing questions, philosophical, moral, spiritual, conundrum, you know, whatever you want to ask these two guys. Put them on a piece of paper, and someone will collect them, I think. And we try to give an opportunity for Katherine and LT to express their views on some of these questions that you may have. Okay, and if, at this point, if you need to take a break or something, please do so. Okay, maybe we can settle down. Our two guests are saying this is a lovely group of students. Really on the ball. Okay, we've really got too many questions to answer tonight. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll just admit it up front, unless you want to stay here till 2 a.m. But I'm just going to screen them carefully, and I actually do see some very similar questions, and I take that as a sign that many people want these questions to be answered. So. I'm going to start with one that's really great, because I don't really know, I have no idea how these guys are going to answer this. It's just too bad. Okay, thank you to everyone who's submitted questions. This one goes like this, and this is for both of you. How would you explain our obsession with beauty and a greater higher purpose if we are primarily driven by an instinct to survive? I guess this is primarily for you, but I think LT should also answer. How would you explain our obsession with beauty and a greater...
Physical beauty, huh? You mean physical beauty?
And a greater higher purpose if we are primarily driven by an instinct to survive? I think it's not just physical beauty, but aesthetics, you know, yeah.
Now you're going to get absolutely tired of me repeating my point. I think I'm an evolutionist in the sense that I like to look at origins. If that had happened, it must be still going on. You know, nature never starts anew. You work from basics. And this obsession with beauty, right? The assumption, therefore, is that if you are able to reach something higher, beauty, how can you say you operate from pure animal instinct? Huh? Now, I'm just going to give a very brief answer to this. Again, you may not accept it, you may find it extremely simplistic, and again, it is within this evolutionist frame. We are very much conditioned in our preferences, in our taste, which means that they are inborn, almost genetically pre-programmed in us because of our evolutionary origins. And what would be that? During that time when we evolved most spectacularly, that would be in the Paleolithic, I'm not even sure, Pleistocene, I'm not even sure, 100,000 years ago, right, when human beings evolved in Africa. And the ideas of beauty, now this has been found, this is such a small example, it has been found that there's a universal love for open spaces, for water, and so on, which could be traced back to our origins in the savanna lands of our evolution. And even in terms of physical beauty, all right, physical beauty that you see in the artist. Now this is actually carrying it a bit too far, but let me share it with you because it amuses me. The exact proportion tests have been conducted on males to see what their perception of female beauty is, and it's amazing. It's across cultures, which means that it must be universal, it must be something inborn. The female beauty, the ideal female, right, has the proportion of waist to hips is exactly 0.07, right? Big hips, small waist, right? Because that reflects fecundity, ability to bear children, fertility, which is again, which goes back to the preference, to a genetic, something genetic, a preference for fertile women, looking out for fertile women, because that would mean, of course, perpetuating your seed. Now you would find this a little bit ridiculous, but so many tests have been conducted, and so many ideas of beauty can actually be mathematically calculated. Right? You may not trust these tests. It makes me, I'm a little bit amused. I don't believe these tests completely, but it simply shows how much in us now, apart from our standards of beauty, are derived from our origins. Even our natural inborn love of sugar, for example, because this was such a rare thing at the time that we were evolving, and we have grown to like it, our love for fat and so on, which actually is quite detrimental to health today. So, I'm afraid you're going to find my answers very tedious, because I like to think that most of the things that we are, our preferences, our tastes, and so on, can actually be traced back to our origins, right back to the time, hundreds of thousands ago when we survived in the grasslands of Africa, our ancestral home.
Thank you. Thank you, Katherine. LT?
I think the audience would have already seen that our two starting points are very different. Katherine starts with the here and now, and I start with God. But for the purpose of beauty, I want to borrow a phrase that she used a couple of times, unity in diversity, because I think beauty comes about not by monotony. See, monotony is one tone, whereas a symphony is many instruments but one melody. Painting is many colors but one theme. A good Indian dish is 40 ingredients but one meal. So you have unity in diversity. And I want to say that this is true of God. Trinity is one God in three persons. And when He makes me in His image, He gives me the capacity to appreciate the combination of unity and diversity. And that is how I believe one of my favorite topics are three expressions of love: pursuit of truth, holiness, and beauty. Because all the three require a unity, diversity, tension. Truth is versus error. You can never say everything is equally truth. Holiness has to be different from sin. But when it comes to aesthetics, it is beautiful because in one sense, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Because I can see something and see it as beautiful. You may see it and probably decide that it's not so beautiful. That's why we marry different types of girls, for your information, just in case.
I only married one.
So, yeah, it's not each of us males. Which means that within the understanding of beauty, the criteria of unity and diversity takes a different view, where both unity and diversity have no moral aspects. So you can begin to see that one of our famous artists who died the other day in Britain, because he was kind of ostracized in India, because he did something which I can't still fully understand. M.F. Hussain made this beautiful canvas and then took a pail of white paint and splashed it across it. Now, this is modern art. I don't know how to fully appreciate it. I remember looking at, again, a Punch cartoon where two elderly ladies looking at modern art come to a hall and say, I think we have been here before because I can recognize the fire extinguisher. There's nothing you can make meaning out of. But I definitely see that you need to have an ultimate reality which has both unity and diversity in its being. Only then we can create this whole understanding of unity. And even the mosaic of human society, as like the multiracial society here that you have in Singapore. And I want to say that all this anchors my belief that unity and diversity are both simultaneously present in God, and therefore being made in the image of God, we are able to see and appreciate it. Yeah.
One little point, diversity, just to add to yours, right? So, of divine origin, but I'm inclined to think that a great deal of the diversity we see comes from different cultures across different geographies and different life histories of nations. So that accounts for a great deal of diversity, not just in standards of beauty, but even in morality.
Thank you both. This next question is for LT. If we are part of the show, how can we be sure that an external revelation is true?
Let me take the opportunity of this question to raise one issue. How would you find
you have to answer the question, okay?
Whether external revelation is true? First of all, I think I made this in response to an earlier question from you, that my understanding of this external revelation should have the capacity to explain what I am familiar with, the material, what Katherine has been talking about, and something which constantly seems to ride on the material. You know, this is very important. I mean, if you want to take away one thing from what I'm saying today, it has to have these two components. Something which integrates the material with the non-material. Something that integrates the temporal with the eternal. Something that integrates quality with quantity. Something that integrates unity and diversity. I can go on giving a list. Now, I would think that the reason I find the Christian revelation convincing is because that it combines the two. Now, I want to say something because, again, in the scientific community, we normally demand external certitude. And the question is put to us who believe in God, why doesn't God make himself more obvious? Now, my Christian answer to that question is that God does not want to force us to believe in him. Because if God were to appear to us, if they were all a bunch of people who don't believe in God, he would have virtually forced us to believe in him, or we would have explained that appearance as something not God. We still have that freedom. So, you notice that this external revelation that comes to us must have a verifiable component, which I believe is what Jesus has come to give. And that verifiable component gives you a certain degree of probability on which you can put your faith. Because if your faith has no basis at all, it turns into superstition. like most of my drivers in the Indian government, who believe that if a cat ran across the road, you would meet with an accident. So one driver would reverse the car. That's positive, this is negative, cancelled. And another one would spit out of the window, the cat is a curse, I'm cursing the curse, because the third one was the best. He would let another car overtake us so that would meet with the accident. So you can have many belief systems. But this belief system must have a solid, verifiable basis. But that will never give you absolute certainty. Do you know why? Because God is calling us into a relationship. A relationship involves risk-taking, and you need to embark in faith into a relationship. Faith is the original, of which gambling is the counterfeit. C.S. Lewis. So you notice that, because there can't be a counterfeit without an original. So we have to look for originals all over. And I want to say something like this. You see, for instance, there's a verse in the Bible that says, there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Why? Because a friend is one whom you have chosen, but you are sentenced to your brothers. You can't choose. The best thing you can do is to convert that sentencing to friendship. So what you have is that there has to be a place for choice. So I think Philip Yancey's book is Rumors of Another World. Why I believe that this external revelation is true is because it combines my human propensity with the reality of who God is, gives me enough evidence to put my faith, so that I can take that step of faith and find inner certitude of relationship, which is really true of all friendships.
This next question is for Katherine. It doesn't say for Katherine here, but I'm pretty sure it is. And I'm just thinking about that book that you wrote about with unhurried thoughts upon my death.
At my funeral.
At my funeral, that's it, yes. Some reflections on your own life, looking back. And I think it's related. This question goes, what is the humanist view of life after death? Do you have one?
Well, I'm going to speak for myself, because there must be different humanist views. I am a complete secularist, which means that I don't believe in a life after death. I think you will probably be shocked to hear that. For me, it is just that. It ends just there. This sounds such a pessimistic, almost a negation of everything that is wonderful in this world. But it is not for me, For me, it's glorious, right? It is a faith that I share with the animal world, part of this wonderful life and creation on earth. It doesn't bother me one bit that there is no life after death. It will bother me if I do not live my life properly. So, what is that question? Do you believe in our, what is your view? No, I'm afraid that there is none. And as I said, it doesn't bother me in the least, because I feel that there is a heaven attainable by us, but it is not in the hereafter. It is here and now. Just as there is a hell to bother us, and we would be responsible for partly creating it. So heaven, hell, God, everything that you attribute to religion, actually I have in my own strange secular system. As I maintain in my speech, there is a Godhead, maybe in inverted commas, but it is not up there. It is inside all of us. There is all the hallmarks of religion, that I don't have. Awe and mystery, not in miracles, I don't particularly care very much for them, but they are in the marvels of nature that you see everywhere. So a Godhead in us, miracle, mystery, and a heaven on earth itself if you want to attain it. So this is as secularist as you can get.
I think it's great that you sort of give a caveat here, that really it's your secularist, humanist, atheist view has the hallmarks of belief in a religion. This one is for you, and I'm only reading this out because I saw 3 questions that were very similar to this. So this one goes like this. To Katherine, you mentioned about your paradigm and belief. Are there times when you have failed in meeting the requirements of your paradigm? How then do you hold yourself accountable?
Oh, I fail all the time, right? It doesn't matter, when you have your goal up there and you move towards it, it seems is good enough for me. I don't believe in perfectibility, but I believe in improvability, so that even if I approach my goal incrementally. Now let me give you an example. It's so silly, you know, and it's so small, but I'll give you an example of how I thought I failed, but will do better. I think I've mentioned this to you, Aaron, and to Rona. Now, a question, I have stated that my highest value is compassion, tolerance, understanding, love of humanity. 3 years ago, there was a woman, you know, in the little subway, that connecting place between Siketang and so on. She was selling her wares, you know, little things that probably people had given her, tissue paper, drinks probably past their expiry date, just as a way of bypassing the law against begging. So about 3 years ago, I went up to her and I picked up a packet drink, which I was going to discreetly throw away. And I gave her $2, and she looked at me and said, no, $4. Instinctively, I was angry. I was thinking, you are a greedy person. You take me for a sucker. But I paid her anyhow, saying, no, I'm never going to you again. Right? 2 years later, I felt sorry. I said, hey, wait a minute. Right? Your giving is conditional. She is probably poor, which is why she has to do this. So I went up to her again. That was 2 years later, and I picked up a packet of tissue paper and gave her 2 coins, one $1 and one 50 cents. And she looked at me and said, no, $3. I was really angry because I felt that my sense of self was being violated. You take me for a sucker? Now, I'm still in a quandary. I would like to give unconditionally, but this woman, I don't like her very much. So I have decided that the next time I see her, I would like to have compassion prevail, but I won't subject myself to the indignity of a transaction bargaining. I dislike it intensely. I'll probably just give her a bit of money and not even say a word. Now, I do not know how you are going to handle this, but these are little compromises that I have to work out for myself.
Thank you. This one's for both of you, I guess. Was there ever a time when you seriously doubted the validity of your worldview? LT first.
Yes, and what I have come to know over these last 49 years is that there is a difference between doubt and unbelief. Unbelief is a settled state of deciding not to believe, whereas doubt is an intermediate station which can take you further. In fact, I'm at the moment reading a book by Leslie Newbegin called Truth to Tell. No, Proper Confidence. Why can you be sure of what you're saying? And he's talking about doubt as a step to certitude. And therefore, I would say that every time you begin to get into a situation, you are able to see that the faith you have embraced has more explanatory power than what you originally suspected. You know, it is something like this. One question here which, because of time, Aaron did not ask about our personal journey. I sometimes feel that when you come into faith when you are a young person, it is like in our days, we used to learn multiplication tables by heart. Now that is because we had to do it. But when we grew up, we began to discover why those multiplication tables were actually true. And in the same way, the things that we believed without thinking through very much, there comes a time when you go to the university, you face people who ask you difficult questions, and then you begin to revisit your beliefs, and you go through a period of kind of a nervous understanding, because I don't think I ever read in the Bible, don't ask questions, simply believe. There's not a single verse like that. So that means when people ask me questions, I have to seriously face them. And when I begin to investigate them, I come out stronger for my belief. And so that is been my own personal journey.
Thank you. This one has, there are actually two people who asked this question in different forms, and this one I will pose it to both of you, even though it was addressed to LT. Is it possible for people with different glasses of worldviews to reach a consensus towards a universal worldview? If so, how can this be achieved? Katherine?
Yeah, I think we can. I think that no matter how disparate and divergent our views are, simply because we are human beings, decent human beings wanting to do good, wanting to live a happy life, there must be some overlapping, as I said, some sharing, basic human values. I bet you, regardless of what belief system you hold, you believe in the sanctity of family, you believe in the value of goodness towards others, the value of discipline and hard work. So these are common values that we share. Ultimately, I think I would rather have faith in human beings than a faith. Right? So I make this distinction, and I'm extremely happy in what I call my religion, in inverted commas, a religion of humanity, a religion of the heart, which to me is extremely important. Ideally, I suppose your religion can be two-layered. The bottom one, which everybody should share, a religion of the heart, a religion of basic goodness, and then the top one that you were born into, that you embrace, your specific religion. The greatest tragedy and the greatest travesty, it seems to me, of human aspirations would be a reverse. When people have that institutionalized religion, but not the humanity. I'll give you an example. My God, I'm taking so much time, but I just remembered this example. A newspaper report of a couple, both of them I think were tourist guides, who had abused their Indonesian maid so badly that when she finally was found, she was half her size, she was starved. And think of the grotesqueness, think of the complete absence of human decency. But what made me angry was this. A picture in the accompanying the newspaper report of the wife. As the trial was going on, she was seen there religiously reading her Bible. And I was thinking, don't mock that holy book. You should have read the Bible before, not after. Now this is the sort of thing that makes me angry, even though I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not a Hindu. The sheer mockery, travesty of your religion when it is accompanied by behavior that is not even decent in the most fundamental sense of the word.
LT.
Let me say something. I think it's part repetition of what I said earlier. That because we are made in the image of God, part of that lens is humanity. I perfectly agree with Katherine on this. But my point is, that lens itself is not satisfactory. It constantly urges you to find, and that, I believe, does not come from inside, that comes from outside. And that's why if you are seriously seeking for a correct, a fuller explanation of reality, I think you will begin to find it in Christ. In fact, very often I feel that, I was reading one of Katherine's blogs, where she speaks about God being mentioned in apophatic terms, which means negative terms: invisible, immortal, incomprehensible, impassible, and all that kind of stuff. Interestingly, Christian theologians are guilty of this. But I think a lot of good books have been written challenging this view. It is Jesus who made God visible, tangible, mortal. He dies. So what you have is a lens which will connect the here and now with the hereafter. That will give you the tension to live in the paradox between the now and the not yet. Unless you begin to capture that, the lens that you have, you are surely progressing towards that. Everyone has a natural aspiration, but sooner or later, when you come across this particular activity of God in Christ, you begin to see that this lens begins to bring the tension together. So that, for example, as a Christian, I don't expect to sit back and wait for the world to come to an end so that things will become better. or that some Christians even want the world to become worse so that Jesus comes. I think Martin Luther said, if Jesus were to come tomorrow, I would plant a tree today. Not like that cultist Jim Jones some years ago, who just made 900 people drink cyanide and die in Guyana. So you have this whole issue. You need a lens which brings together the here and now with the hereafter. And I think that's the direction in which we should be moving.
Okay. This next one is a big question. You should be expecting this. But I think this question, in the interest of time, we want to get in a couple more questions. I would really love it if the both of you give a very succinct answer to this, really. And so take your time to think about it. And the question is this: why is there suffering? So not cause and effect, purpose. Why is there suffering? Take your time, and whoever wants to can answer first.
Maybe the less succinct should start.
I'll beat you.
I want to say that suffering, of course, according to the Bible, is part of the reality of moral rebellion against God. Existential suffering is one of the ways in which we understand that we are rebels. We are against God, because when God creates a universe of moral order, and when I break it, and I'm supposed to be in charge of His creation, then I completely upset the whole order. But I also want to say that all suffering is not bad. Because if I did not get a fever, I would not know that I have an infection. I think the pain is a gift which nobody wants. So that's a book, actually, written by Philip Yancey and Dr. Paul Brand, who worked among leprosy patients in India. And you realize that the loss of sensation, therefore loss of sensation of pain, can cause greater danger to the one who suffers. So suffering becomes a very important learning ground, which is why Lewis said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world.
I'll stop you there.
No, I stopped.
Again, I operate within this naturalistic frame, and I see suffering and so on as part of the human lot, part of the operation of chance and necessity in this world of ours, whether it's natural disasters, pandemics, and so on. Now, I'm going to tell you something that will probably amuse you. You know, I wish there were a God, because, you know, if there were, He would be reasonable, He would listen to me. And you know what I would do, almost like a heroic gesture? I wouldn't mind dying, right? Because you have to die before you see God. I wouldn't mind dying, but please give me 1 week to resolve my worldly affairs first, right? I wouldn't mind dying and to appear before God, to be at the negotiating table with Him and say, God, are you aware of the suffering that's going on in the world? And I'm not talking about diseases, old age, that's okay. But suffering that just cannot be explained in any other way. In any other way, except, I suppose, through the cruelty of chance. And I want to bring up an example, because I watch so many TV programs on it. Congenital diseases, sufferings of children who are helpless. I find it very difficult to reach that degree of faith where I'm told, this child suffers, all right, it's not her fault, but things will be righted in the other world. I find it extremely difficult to accept this, to say, please have faith. I cannot suspend my faith, right? I work by reason, and we all work by reason. It will be impossible for us, in fact, to live in a group and in a community without making use of reason. But if I'm told, hey, suspend your reason for this particular situation. So this child is in great suffering. Here are people, you know, who are devastated by disease and so on. But it will be all righted in the next world. Now that I find extremely difficult to understand, which is why I have this funny little experiment to say, hey God, why don't we sit down and talk? And could you please get rid of that? Never mind, let the other things stay, disease, cancer, and so on. But children, God, could you make an exception for them?
this leads me very naturally to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is this. You know, it's quite obvious that you have very strong moral outrage to certain very serious and grave offenses against humanity. You know, so we talked about, you know, child abuse and murder, rape, all those things. Does this mean that you believe that everybody needs to feel the same moral outrage against these crimes? And does that not mean that you believe in an absolute and objective morality?
You understand me? Yes. Okay. Right? No, I don't expect people to feel the same way. For example, religious-minded people, including my friends, they're very calm and serene about it. I get all worked up. They say, wait a minute, you don't presume that you understand the purpose. Right? The purpose of suffering, right? Here are people who are suffering, but how do you know God's purpose and plan for them? Now, I'm afraid I cannot look beyond the world, right? The world as I see it, and I get extremely upset that there is suffering, especially among the defenseless. Now, I love children very much, and I get extremely angry when people who are in the know, for example, the Catholic Church that has been around for 2,000 years, right? Not doing exactly very much about a horrific crime that has been going on for 4 decades. Now, this sort of thing upsets me. Sometimes you read in the newspapers about contractors taking advantage of these poor Bangladeshi workers. So my rage is against people who have no means of redress, who have no means of, and that makes me very angry. It's a moral outrage, which no, I don't expect other people to feel, because there would be a different way of looking at it. Huh? God's will, purpose, things can be righted in the next world and so on.
This one's for LT. If the
because I think, let me frankly say that I am listening very carefully to Katherine, and you have so much to say to those of us who say we follow Christ. Because in the Bible, God is declared as a God of justice. I mean, He's a defender of the poor. And so if those who follow Christ do not have that same moral outrage, I think something is wrong with us. I think there is a deeper reason why God doesn't directly intervene and stop evil, because if He were to do that, He will have to suspend our freedom as well. He will have to stop, suppose I'm about to punch air and He has to stop me, and then when He punches me, He has to stop him, and there will be total madness and a methodless madness, something like Bruce Almighty, where everybody wins the lottery, but everybody gets only $16.17. So you have a peculiar situation in which, without suspending freedom, God has to do His work. And there's a very interesting experience some years ago when computers were just coming up in our top engineering institutions in Bengal, where Chatterjee is a very common surname, but all students were doing chats. And so the professor thought we must ban chat. What he discovered, to his great horror, that when you banned chat, you were banning Chatterjees. So there was an uproar. See, the whole point is there is so much of evil, which is why ultimately God Himself suffers in Jesus Christ. I think the ultimate answer God will ask all these nagging questions is that I am a God who has experienced the worst travesty of justice. We are in the faculty of law. There's one place where there was a total miscarriage of justice, and that was when Jesus was crucified. So when we are talking about suffering, we are talking about a historic suffering, not a mythological suffering, where God Himself identifies with our suffering. So someday we will know the answer to some of these nagging questions, but I think the broad outlines are already clear.
I think the question of suffering really goes to the heart of a lot of worldviews.
Yes, indeed.
This one is for you, LT. If the basic problem with a strictly utilitarian or evolutionist view of life, devoid of a higher presence, is explaining that something cannot come out of nothing, how then do you explain the existence of that ultimate being?
Good question. If God created everything, who created God? Now that sounds a very smart question, but there's a problem with that question. Because God by definition is one who's uncreated. What we are actually saying is that we have the material world. I mean, now I'm giving a physics example. we are having a material world which comes into existence. So that which exists before the material world has to be something which is non-material. We have a world which is a temporal world. We are living in a world of time. So space-time, that's Einstein, and that's what the universe is all about. So what comes into, what brings it into existence should be outside of time. So starting with physics, I arrive at a very interesting biblical phrase, eternal spirit. One who is beyond time is eternal, one who is not material is spirit. If God is eternal spirit, then it is not impossible to posit that God creating a temporal, which means a world which will eventually come to an end, and a material world. It's very interesting that how do fairy stories begin? Once upon a time. How does the Bible begin? In the beginning, which is a huge difference. Because fairy stories happen in time, the Bible begins with time. Which means that one of the famous reformers, John Calvin, was also a very short-tempered man. He was asked by some people, what was God doing before he created the world? And his spontaneous answer, he was creating hell for you scoffers. Now that was a bad answer from the point of view of physics, because outside of Genesis 1 verse 1, words like before and after have no meaning. Because we are coming into time and matter from one who's beyond time and beyond matter. I find that eminently explicable of the reality in which we live.
I will just do one last question, and this one is very simple. Who is responsible for your life? It's so difficult, unanswerable. And that might be the answer you want to share.
Well, if God is out of the picture, you think of a human agent, myself. As an adult myself, I can't think of anybody who's responsible for my life or what I do with myself, because I'm an adult. Yeah.
Let me answer that question with another story from my life. This was, maybe you should publish my stories. This was one of my bosses in the 70s. He was chief engineer, I was a staff officer, but I was holding a job in which I was reporting directly to the chief engineer. But about 10 minutes before office close, he would ring me on the intercom and say, LT, come to my room, let's have a theological discussion. So during those 10 minutes, he was not my boss, I was not my subordinate. He was a Hindu gentleman married to a Catholic lady. And he said, you Christians believe in free will. That's where the responsibility comes in. But I am a fatalist, which means everything is fixed. I'm not responsible for anything, so to speak. I said, sir, if you are a fatalist, today when you go down and you cross Parliament Street in Delhi, and when you step back from an oncoming bus, you have exercised your free will. If you are a real fatalist, you should close your eyes and cross the road, because the date of your death has already been fixed. Now you have an interesting situation. So you have on one side, you as a human being recognize that you have a certain responsibility. But even a person who denies the existence of God, who would go far beyond Katherine, would still admit that he or she takes decisions on the basis of factors outside his or her control. So you are having an interesting combination here of the natural and the supernatural, of the human and the divine. And this is absolutely on target with God making humans in his image. For those of you who believe in God, particularly the God of the Bible, if I were to ask you whether you are here by the will of God, I hope you will say yes. If I ask you, are you here by your free will, you will still say you are here by exercise of your free will. So the whole beautiful paradigm here is that under the sovereign will of God, we are acting freely and therefore we are responsible. And because we use our responsibilities so irresponsibly, we have to cast ourselves on the grace of God and salvation in Jesus Christ, so that you begin to use your free will responsibly in obedience to the will of God, which is what my view is of responsibility.
Before we end, I would maybe just give each of you 1 minute, 90 seconds, 90 seconds, just to say something that you wanted to say throughout this evening, but maybe something you want to repeat or something in reply to what the other person has said. Here's your chance.
I don't know. Well, maybe something that I always tell my friends, when they ask me, give us your thoughts about how to lead a good life, how to lead a fruitful life, useful life. And I always say, hey, one of probably the most reliable things, one of the most dependable things is actually to use yourself as reference. You are your own judge, you are your own tribunal, you are your own maybe even executioner. Right? When you operate in this way, you are probably at your most authentic self. You probably would agree with me. I'm not talking of from the position of a pure narcissist or an egoist. No, it's probably because you understand yourself so well that you will be most authentic when you make judgments independent of anybody. I'll give you an example, Uli. I hope I don't sound too hubristic. But as a political commentator, I cannot take direction from those who are interested. People actually contact me and say, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? I cannot take direction as a writer from my publisher who says, hey, sex sells. Now it is a time when people are extremely interested in the supernatural. And I say, oh, no. If I do that, I will fall flat on my face. I will have lost that one thing that defines me, authenticity. And it could mean my flaws. It doesn't matter. In fact, I like myself flawed because I'm human in this way. So yes, using yourself as reference point for virtually everything. And that's where I get my peace of mind.
What I would say is that with the many things about which I agree with Katherine, I would say that the worldview I have presented explains what she has said and much more. It gives significance to what she has said. For example, this whole authenticity is such an important thing. But how to know that my way of judging myself is right? That is also comes from outside of me. So there is something inside of me which responds, which resonates with what comes from outside of me. And that I find absolutely in concord with the understanding of a God who makes us humans in His image. And therefore I think, I would actually say, therefore I would go beyond the word God. God is in some ways, God is not even a religious subject. Maybe we should have the next true conversations on, is God a religious subject? I would be very happy to contribute my little mite. I want to say that this God became visible in Jesus. And therefore He is not a negatives, He is full of positives. And therefore the way I can summarize is investigate Jesus. And that's the best thing I can say.
Well, friends, this brings us to the end of the very first forum under this series. I'm just hoping and looking forward to future sessions like that. We'll bring in similarly qualified and passionate and articulate and thoughtful speakers to exchange views and to share views in this way. I hope you enjoy yourself and certainly given me a lot to think about. I want you to please join me in expressing a deep, sincere respect and appreciation to those of us. On behalf of the organizers and the small token for each of you, okay, we're done for tonight. Thank you. Good night and see you again soon.